The Taoists think that our lives are filled with that exact problem, that we're always trying to figure out what people want ahead of time and trying to bend ourselves into that particular mold, when in fact, if we just allowed our real nature to come through, things would be much better. The goal, positively, is to attune ourselves and our activities with our own nature. Now, our nature as particulars is continuous with the nature of the Tao as a whole. So in talking about our nature, there's one sense in which we can talk about our individual nature coming through, as when we talk about someone's personality. Use your real personality, don't try to pretend that you're somebody else. On the other hand, there's also a sense that the flow of nature as a whole is operating through us. And many of the passages in really both of the texts that I mentioned have to do with the way of allowing nature to flow through you. As a consequence, one of the emphases in both of these texts is on what might look like relative passivity, not asserting yourself, allowing yourself to be flexible, allowing the forces of your situation to work through you. Now, for some Taoists, this tended to be such an extreme goal that they set as a goal for themselves, the idea of being a recluse, just living out in nature, allowing life to kind of move as it did. Obviously, someone would need to be providing food, and it's not really very clear how Taoists who wanted to be recluses intended to do that in all cases. But the idea is that basically you don't assert, you kind of retire from the world, live in nature, become one with nature, and that's really the best way to conserve your vitality and live a good life. Others, however, often feeling that it was absolutely necessary to be involved in society, view Taoism as really a kind of recipe for how to be most effective. It's not necessary in order to be a Taoist to think that you absolutely have to give up all goals in any sense. After all, many people who think that Taoism makes a lot of sense do have goals. They have jobs, at the very least, and certain obligations that they need to fulfill. But the idea here is that you fulfill these things best when you really allow the forces of nature to work with you. And the problem is that too often what we do is get caught up in certain ideas about what success is, what we want to happen, and work so hard bending a situation to fit our preconceptions that we choose unobvious ways of doing things instead of allowing things to more naturally take a shape that's really much more stable. Another theme within Taoism is a skepticism of language. Now, this may sound like a pretty familiar theme by now. We've mentioned a number of philosophers who've pointed out that language is limited. Though it's a tool of ours, sometimes it interferes with us. What the Taoists think that language does is interfere with our perception. And so one way of focusing on what the positive aspiration of a Taoist is to be perceptive, to really take in what the situation is. If you think about a situation where someone that you've sort of got sized up is going to say something, and think about how you listen if you've already decided, well, this person is a conservative. This person is a liberal. This person is a Marxist. This person is a reactionary. The way you listen in each of those cases, just because of your label on that person, is going to be very different. And the Taoists think we do this in all kinds of ways. We've already decided what we expect to hear, and that's what we do hear. We know what we already expect to see, and that's what we actually see. We almost don't notice things that interfere with the sort of grid that we've already established by means of our concepts and our language. So interestingly, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching is the following: "The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name." The suggestion here, among many, and I think there are lots of ways that this can be taken, one of the suggestions is that anything that we have a kind of category for, even though that might reflect something about a situation when we have the perception that leads us to form this category, if we hang on to the category, we're going to miss the phenomena. So if we decide, this is going to be an illustration of what the conservative viewpoint is, then we're going to be paying attention only to those things that reinforce our own ideas. Our perception is not going to take in much of anything that is either dissonant or not actually positively supporting the idea we already have in the first place. Zhuangzi also reflects this idea when he compares our language to a fishing net. And he points out that what's really important in the case of using a fishing net is that you're looking for fish, not the fact that the net is as it is. His comment, the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. So he's suggesting that basically we have these various ways of freezing our insights, and these are useful to us. I mean, obviously language is a tool, and he himself is writing, so he's not adverse to using it in any kind of context. But nevertheless, there's a danger if we don't somehow take as the prior concern what's actually going on around us. Language is helpful to help us remember certain patterns that we've observed, but too much of the time we pay so much attention to generalizations we've already formulated in language that we stop paying attention to the world, and that's what's dangerous. What we really need to do is be more attentive to the world itself, which in this case is going to be understood as the Tao. The kind of knowledge that would be recommended from a Taoist point of view is therefore not going to be primarily verbal or conceptual. One can describe the kind of knowledge that's encouraged as really knowing how rather than knowing that. Zhuangzi uses lots of examples of craftspeople and artists as people that have a tremendous kind of knowledge, but it's not knowledge that you can definitely articulate in words. It would probably be easier to teach a lot of crafts or arts if it were easy to put these things into words. I think, for example, of cases where people are learning to play an instrument for the first time. Well, of course, there are things that the teacher can tell the student. For example, learning to play the piano. Well, how to hold your hand. No, you're doing it a little bit, you're holding your hands a little bit too high, or your hands aren't really high enough. Those sorts of things you can use language a little bit to gesture toward, but even then, it's always kind of pushing in a certain direction. It's not absolutely pinpointing what it is that needs to happen. And there's a lot of assimilation of the whole art that comes about when one is doing this as well. Another example is driving. I remember when I first started driving thinking, how am I ever going to keep track of all of these cars around me? And my dad, who was driving with me, said, don't worry about them. Now, of course, he didn't mean don't pay attention to the rest of traffic, but what he meant was I don't have to be in charge of how all of those are moving. That's something that I can take in a way as a side concern, but my focus needed to be what I was doing. And in a sense, that's what the Taoists are recommending too. Instead of kind of scattered looking at all kinds of things that might be a problem, paying attention to what you're doing, knowing how to do something is a whole art rather than just knowing some facts of the matter, knowing where the cars are relative to each other, knowing how fast they're moving. If I spent my time when I was driving calculating all that, I'd be a real menace on the road. And that's exactly what the Taoists think often happens in our everyday life, because we spend a lot of time focusing on this or that observation that we've already made. We kind of lose track of what we're doing. And the artist, the craftsperson, is someone who really knows how to focus on what they're doing and use what they've learned over time to produce a certain kind of art. Because a relative passivity is encouraged in Taoism, some of the recommendations that the Taoists suggest are negatively expressed. Again, we have this notion of via negativa, if you will, the idea of saying something in a negative way in order to gesture towards something that's much more positive. Probably the most general term of this sort that comes up in Taoist writings is wu wei, which is sometimes translated non-action, although non-assertive action is probably a better translation.